Okay, starting from 76C of the Phaedo, using the Balboa translation. In the last session, Socrates and Simmias were discussing whether we learn or we recollect knowledge. And so the discussion is going on from there, beginning with Socrates. Accordingly, then, it does not appear to you that everybody knows these selves. What are they? These are the real beings or the ideas that are recollected. I think they included the equal. Here we go. The equal, beauty, good, just. So these are the ideas which must be known, because when we see real instances of them in the sensory world, then we know they approach them in likeness. So they're like the example in the last session was that if you see two sticks that are what you would call equal in the visual sense, they're not actually precisely equal. They're just very, very similar. But you see them as equal because you must have recollection of something, the idea of the equal. And so this is what Socrates is talking about, using the Greek word auta. And those, I believe, refer to those ideas, the idea of the good, just, etc. In any case, Simmias, not at all. Socrates, accordingly then, they recollect that which they learned at some time, necessarily. At what time, then, would our souls grasp the knowledge of selves? Certainly not after the time when we were indeed born as men. No doubt. Before that time, then? Yes. Accordingly, then, O Simmias, our souls also existed previously, apart from the body, before they existed in human form, and when they possessed mindfulness. Unless we acquire these kinds of knowledge at birth, O Socrates, for that time still remains. Okay. So when this knowledge come, because here Socrates is asking Simmias when it is that we receive the knowledge. So the idea would be that you're born, and therefore after you're born, you recollect the ideas of the good, beauty, just, etc. And before you're born, here is where you acquire the knowledge, acquire of the ideas. Because here it says, O Simus, our souls also existed previously apart from the body, before they existed in human form and when they possessed mindfulness, phronesin. But Simius points out, unless we acquire these kinds of knowledge at birth, O Socrates, for that time still remains. So Simius is saying, here, at birth is where you acquire knowledge of the ideas. Socrates, this being the case, O companion, then at what other time did we lose them? For surely we are indeed not in possession of them at our birth, as we just now agreed. Or do we lose them at the very time in which we also acquire them? Or have you some other time you can mention? Right, so the point being, where do you lose them? Because if you're seeing it as a cycle where here you're born, here you die, and in this bit here you're recollecting, so presumably once you die you either have the knowledge or acquire it. So you either have the knowledge from the past life, or you acquire it here as a soul. And the question that Socrates has is, well then if you have this knowledge, which you're going to bring with you once you're born, and Simius points out that, or at least puts forward the idea that you acquire or have this knowledge when you're born, then when would you lose it in that case? Because you've got it here. Then Simius replies, not any other time, that is, O Socrates, since it escaped my notice that I was saying nothing or talking nonsense. Socrates, take notice then, O Simius. Must the following be the case for us? If on the one hand, that which we are always murmuring is the case, that the beautiful and the good and every ousia such as this, ousia I believe is the Greek word for essence. I think it's when you contemplate yourself, but let me check that. So this word here, ousia. There it is. From ancient Greek, ousia, yeah, that's the one we want. And So that which is one's one's substance, property, substance, essence. And the etymology is from on, present participle of Amy to be, plus ia, the abstract noun suffix, usia. I thought there was an element of it which was supposed to be about turning upon oneself. But I don't see that here. Maybe in the Greek? Essence. Well, in any case, we have and it's from to be. Which was Amy. So Socrates was saying about the beautiful and the good and every being or essence such as these. We also refer all the things from which the perceptions arise, aesthesion, so the aesthetic, to that same ousia or being, to the same. By discovering that they exist according to hypaxis, upakosan, prior to us. And so we must necessarily compare those to to them, to the selves, and just as if they do exist in this way, and it must also be in this way for our soul, and it must also be this way prior to our birth. But if, on the other hand, they do not exist in any way, could this logos or reasoning even be discussed? Accordingly, then it has to be in this way, and there is an equal necessity for them to exist, and also for our souls to exist, and before we were born. And if this is not the case with they themselves, then neither is it the case with those that follow. Well, that doesn't make any sense to me, so I'm going to have to unpack it. So let's have a look again. Socrates, take notice then, Onesimus, must the following be the case for us? If on the one hand, that which we are always murmuring is the case, that the beautiful, the good, and every being such as this, we also refer all the things from which the perceptions arise to that same being. So we refer all the sense perceptions to so we have the good, itself. What else was there? The beautiful itself. And every ousia, being, essence, such as this, we also refer all the things from which the perceptions arise to that same being. I think so. Here are all the things that can be sensed. So here is sense perception. Here there's mind perception. And so here the eye will see these objects. But then I think it's saying we also refer all these things from which the perceptions arise to that same ousia, meaning this ousia, these, the beings themselves. So once we see those, then we refer them. But I think I'm just going to check my other translation to see how it puts it there. It says here, if those realities we are always talking about exist, the beautiful and the good and all that kind of reality, and we refer all the things we perceive to that reality, which is the bit I've just expanded on there, discovering that it existed before and is ours, and we must compare these things with it, then just as they exist, so our soul must exist before we are born. If these realities do not exist, then this argument is altogether futile. Is this the position that there is an equal necessity for those realities to exist and for our souls to exist before we were born? If the former do not exist, neither do the latter. Well, still don't understand it, but I will take a look again. So that is the correct bit, that they refer to these things from which the perceptions arise to that same essence. By discovering that they exist according to hyparxis prior to us. Not sure what hyparxis means. And I'm not sure that it's an English word. Not one the Wiktionary knows about. Essential nature. summit beginning or hierarch of a hierarchy. Right, okay. And in this other translation, discovering that it existed before and is ours. In the other translation I've got, this is referring to the realities we are always talking about exist, the beautiful and the good and all that kind of reality. And we refer all the things we perceive to that reality, discovering that it existed before and is ours. Discovering that they existed before and is ours. So if referring to these must, one, exist before, and they must also become ours. That's according to the other translation. What about this Balboa? By discovering that they exist according to hypostasis prior to us, and so we must necessarily compare those to them. Ekene tauta. To that one. That one what? We also refer all things from which the perceptions arise to that same essence by discovering that they exist prior to us, and so we must necessarily compare that one just as if that exists in this way. In the other translation, and we compare these things with it, then just as they exist, so our soul must exist before we are born. Maybe it's in this bit here, become ours, as in we must have, I think that means they become ours in the sense that they become our knowledge. Because if they exist, these realities or essences or ideas, if they exist, but we don't as mindful souls, then how would we be able to take this knowledge on into, once we're born, in order for our sense perceptions to have something to refer to? So the knowledge of these must be passed on to the soul. And then the soul passes it on, which is how we're then able to refer to these ideas. I think that's what it's saying. So Must the following be the case for us? If on the one hand that which we are always murmuring is the case, that the beautiful and the good and every being such as this, we also refer all the things from which the perceptions arise to that same essence, by discovering that they exist according to hypostasis prior to us. Okay, so the essences or ideas exist prior to us, and so we must necessarily compare those, and just as if they do exist in this way, and it must also be in this way for our soul, and it must also be this way prior to our birth. But if, on the other hand, they do not exist in any other way, could this reasoning even be discussed? Accordingly, then, it has to be in this way, and there is an equal necessity for them to exist, them being the ideas, equal necessity for the ideas to exist, and also for our souls to exist, and before we were born. And if this is not the case with they themselves, then neither is it the case with those that follow. Well, I think that's all it's saying. And also that the soul must come with it. The soul must be born with these ideas, in the sense that they're latent there but must be recollected. Let me just check the other translation. If those realities we are always talking about exist, the beautiful and the good and all that kind of reality, and we refer all the things we perceive to that reality, discovering that it existed before and is ours, and we compare these things with it. I imagine that's we compare these things means things that we perceive with our senses. We compare these things with it. Then, just as they exist, so our soul must exist before we are born. If these realities do not exist, then this argument is altogether futile. Is this the position, that there is an equal necessity for those realities to exist and for our souls to exist before we were born? If the former do not exist, neither do the latter. And so if the former do not exist, the former being the ideas, neither do the latter, and the latter being the soul, because it says in the sentence before, is this the position, that there is an equal necessity for those realities to exist, the ideas, and for our souls to exist before we were born? If the former do not exist, i.e. the ideas, neither do the latter. Why? If these ideas don't exist, why would it mean that the soul doesn't exist? I can see that if these don't exist, then the soul would go into birth without the knowledge of these ideas, because it couldn't have the knowledge of them if they don't exist. But why does it follow that the soul can't exist? That's what it seemed to say in this other translation, because it says, is this the position, that there is an equal necessity for those realities to exist and for our souls to exist before we were born? If the former do not exist, neither do the latter. Whereas in the Balboa, and so we must necessarily compare those to selves, and just as if they do exist in this way, and it must also be in this way for our soul, and it must also be this way prior to our birth. But if, on the other hand, they do not exist in any other way, could this reasoning even be discussed? Accordingly, then, it has to be in this way, and there is an equal necessity for them to exist, and also for our souls to exist, and before we were born. And if this is not the case with they themselves, then neither is it the case with those that follow. And a me talta. There is an equal necessity for them to exist, and also for our souls to exist. And before we were born, and if this is not the case with them, then neither is it the case with those that follow. Well, I'm not entirely sure what that's supposed to mean. Maybe by reading on it'll be clearer, because I've looked at this for a little bit now and I'm not any clearer than this. That if the ideas exist, the soul must have knowledge of them, because it's through the soul that we can refer to them. And therefore the soul must bring that knowledge, even if it has to be recollected, into life when we're born. That's how I'm understanding that bit, but maybe if I read on, it'll become clearer. Simmias. The self-same necessity appears to me to be so absolutely, O Socrates, and the logos, or reasoning, indeed takes refuge in beauty, in the same way that our soul and the essence of which you speak both exist before we are born. For to me at least there is nothing so clear as this, that all natures such as these most especially do exist, such as the beautiful and the good, and all those of which you spoke just now. And it appears to me that it has been sufficiently demonstrated. Well, I think that's just referring to that same argument. Socrates. But what about Cebes? For we must necessarily persuade Cebes also. He is sufficiently convinced, as I believe at least, and yet he is the most obstinate of men as far as being mistrustful of speech, since I believe that he is not in need of being persuaded of this, that our soul existed before we were born. However, it does in no way appear that it has also been proven to me whether self exists even after we die. I think that means whether it exists even after we die. So this is the soul existed before we were born. So we have soul exists, and then we have before birth, and after death. And this is still Simmias. And he's saying, yeah, okay, that's been demonstrated that it exists before birth due to this referring to the ideas and the soul being mindful of them. But then he's questioning whether it has been demonstrated for after death. However, it does in no way appear that it has also been proven to me whether it, auto, exists even after we die, since the opinion of the many, which Cebes mentioned just now, is still standing in the way, that whenever the human soul dies, it is dispersed and scattered, and this is the end of her existence. So this is the idea that after death. So this is the opinion of the many, or how's it put? The opinion of the many. So many say that the soul is then after death dispersed and scattered. Since the opinion of the many which Cebes mentioned just now is still standing in the way, that whenever the human soul dies, it is dispersed and scattered, and this is the end of her existence. End of existence. For on the one hand, let it be given that the self comes to be and is put together from some other source and exists even before she enters a human body. But on the other hand, after having done this, she also then departs. What is there to keep the self from also coming to an end and from being utterly destroyed at that time? I think it's referring to the soul here. So, for on the one hand, let it be given that the soul comes to be and is put together from some other source and exists even before she enters a human body. But on the other hand, after having done this, she also then departs. What is there to keep her from also coming to an end and from being utterly destroyed at that time? And now we have Cebes. You speak well, O Simmias, for even as it seems that only half of that which is necessary has been proven, that our soul existed before we were born. But on the other hand, it is necessary to further prove that it will exist no less after our death, if the proof intends to have completion. So this is the question here. After death, what happens? And Cebes is also interested in this question. Socrates. On the one hand, even now, it has already been proven, O Simmias and Cebes, if you will combine this reasoning with the same one which we agreed on before this one, that all the living are generated from the dead. So, Socrates, all the living are generated from the dead. And that, I think, was the argument that we had. Awake. If you're awake, you can then be asleep. And if you're asleep, you can then become awake. And the process of going from awake to asleep is falling asleep. And the process of going from asleep to awake is waking up. And so in the same way, we have birth, hence alive, going then to death, and from death to birth, alive, in a similar way. And so, for if on the one hand the soul exists before, then on the other hand it is necessary that when she arises into life, and also by having been born, must come to be from nowhere else than from the dead, and from being dead. How could it not be necessary for the self to exist after death, seeing that the self must indeed come to life again? Right, so if you're going from death to life, and you have a soul when you're alive, when you die, you need to also have a soul so that when you go from being dead to being alive, you've got one. Otherwise, where does it come from? My question would be, though, could it not be dispersed and become a different constitution? So, for example, if you had, I don't know, two souls, or even three, let's think about this. If you had two souls that were, one was constituted of red and blue, and the other one was constituted of yellow and pink. If when you die, so this is like soul A, and this is soul B, and this is death. Could it not be that then you have a scattering in this way? And I don't know. And then you can, from that, create soul C, and soul D. So that it doesn't mean that they're the same souls. And in this one, in this idea here, the soul would scatter. And then here you have a new constitution of the soul, newly constituted souls. If that was the case, though, yes, in death they could learn the ideas and then be born as these souls with the ideas. But when they died, they would forget the ideas because they would become newly constituted souls. So I'm just wondering, that's my own question. Could that not be the case? And has anything been said as to whether this is discounted? In any case, by having been born, it must come from nowhere else than from the dead and from being dead. How could it not be necessary for the self to exist after the death, seeing that the self must indeed come to life again? Thus the very thing you speak of has even now been proven. Nevertheless, on the other hand, it appears to me that you and Simmias would also be pleased to thoroughly examine this argument even more, and since without reason you have the fear of children, that the wind dissolves and scatters the self when departing from the body, at the time when one happens to die, not in a calm air, but in a high wind. Seabees, laughing. Assuming that we have that fear, O Socrates, try to persuade us, or rather, on the other hand, assume that we are not afraid, but perhaps there is a child in us which has fears such as these. Therefore, let us attempt to persuade this inner child not to fear death, just as if death were a mormalukia, a fantastic she-monster. Mormalukia. This is Seabees. So now we have Seabees and Socrates, and we're looking at the scattering of the soul. And I'm just going to look, because sometimes in the other translation it gives you a bit of context for a word such as this, mormalukia. Oh, try to persuade him not to fear death like a boogeyman. Right, so they're both translating it similarly. Okay. Back to the text. Socrates. But it is necessary to sing to self every day until you shall sing them away. I'll be talking about this monster. Oh, in the other translation, try to persuade him not to fear death like a bogey. You should, said Socrates, sing a charm over him, death, I imagine, every day until you have charmed away his fears. Over who? Well, it is necessary to sing alla cre epadein auto ecastes emeras eos an exepacete epaedo. Well, I don't know where sing is. Epadein? Auto. Sing to yourself every day. Just going to check what the word here is. If this is the word for sing. Epidexe. Epidexias. Epidexy. Demonstrate, display, show, sing. I'm not sure what this bit means. Whether it's to sing the fear away, or sing the monster away, or sing death away. And I'm not sure what the word for sing being used is either. In the other translation, it's Cebes laughed and said, assuming that we were afraid, Socrates, trying to change our minds, or rather, do not assume that we are afraid, but perhaps there is a child in us who has these fears. Try to persuade him not to fear death like a bogey. You should, said Socrates, sing a charm over him every day until you have charmed away his fears. Oh, the boy, the child. But perhaps there is a child in us which has fears such as these. Therefore, let us attempt to persuade this inner child not to fear death, just as if death were a monster. And then Socrates, but it is necessary to sing to that inner child every day. Could it be cray? Every day. What's this cray then? Also, what's the Greek word for sing? Ado, psalo, or tragodo? Okay, so that wasn't helpful. What's this word then? Cray. Cray. Have to, ought, should. So that must be the necessary bit. But it is necessary to sing epidane. So that must be the word. But I couldn't find it. Maybe if I just do a Google search. Well, I can't see it, so I'm going to leave it for now. Going back to the text, Cebes. Where then, O Socrates, shall we find a good singer of such particulars when you leave us? Socrates. Hellas, on the one hand, is a large country, O Cebes, in which there are certainly good people. On the other hand, the non-Hellenic races are also numerous, all those which it is necessary to thoroughly search for such a singer that is being sought for, sparing neither expense nor toil, as there is nothing on which you should more necessarily spend your money than it is necessary for yourselves to search among one another also, for it is likely you will not easily discover those able to do this better than yourselves. So Cebes said, it is Cebes who's got this inner child. And what is the inner child fearful of? Who fears that death is also the end of the soul. And Socrates suggested that Cebes ought to sing a charm until you have charmed away his fears. Sing a charm to get rid of these fears. Which is then when this goes on about the importance of finding someone necessary to sing to this inner child every day until you shall sing them away. Could it be this Emeras? Genitive singular of Emera Oh, this is the day, so this is every day. So sing every day. So it must be this epidane. It's just a shame I don't know what it means. I mean, it must mean sing, but I don't know what the origins are. And so then this section here is about finding someone who is able to sing this charm over the fear. But he says, it is likely, then it is necessary for yourselves to search among one another also, for it is likely you will not easily discover those able to do this better than yourselves. So this charm, who can sing the charm to quieten the fears? Who better than yourselves? So moving back to the text, Cebes, on the one hand, this shall surely be done, but on the other hand, let us go back to where we left off, if it is appealing to you. But of course, it is indeed appealing. How could it not be? It is good that you say this. Is it not the case, then, that we must necessarily ask ourselves something like this? For what kind of nature is it proper to undergo this affection? That of being dispersed. So, okay, so this was basically a bit of a side show about charming yourself. But then we're back onto this subject. Nature which is dispersed. And so this is about singing a charm. So what kind of thing, or what kind of nature is dispersed? And for the purpose of Socrates, and for the purpose of preventing what kind of affection is this dispersion feared? And what kind of nature does not undergo this affection of self-dispersion? And after this, in turn, we should examine to which of the two is the soul akin. And as a result of this, we should either be of good cheer or fear for the sake of our soul. Right, so we ask something like this: what kind of nature is it proper to undergo this affection, that of being dispersed? And for the purpose of preventing what kind of affection, and for the purpose of preventing what kind of affection is self-dispersion feared? So we're looking at nature which is dispersed. Also here, what kind of nature does not undergo the affection of self-dispersion? So nature not dispersed. Here we have is, and here we have not. But I'm not sure what the bit before that means. This bit, for what kind of nature is it proper to undergo this affection, that of being dispersed? So I'm just going to check that in the other translation. What kind of thing is likely to be scattered On behalf of what kind of thing should one fear this? And for what kind of thing should one not fear it? On behalf. On behalf of what kind of thing should one fear this, and for what kind of thing should one not fear it? And therefore, for this kind of thing, one should fear. And this kind of thing, one does not need to fear. I think that's what that's saying, at least in the other translation. For what kind of nature is it proper to undergo this affection? I think the affection is the fear. What kind of nature is it proper to undergo this affection? And for the purpose of preventing that kind of affection, is self-dispersion feared? Well, in any case, that's what they're looking at, whether the scattering or dispersion happens. What type of things do disperse or scatter? And then he says, and after this in turn, we should examine which of the two is the soul akin. So it's either that one or that one, soul akin. And as a result of this, we should either be of good cheer or fear for the sake of our soul. Cebes, what you say is true. Take notice then, on the one hand, that which is a composite and is composed by its very nature properly undergoes this dispersion. For this nature is divided, and in the same way as it was composed. Whereas on the other hand, if indeed this other something properly and simply happens to be incomposite, it will not undergo these affections. Right, so we've got composite. So it is similar to what I was saying earlier, actually. So it wouldn't be like a whole like this. It would be something composite that was a bit more like this. And compared to something which is incomposite. So there we have it. So we've got this which is composite, and this which is not composite, or rather, I don't know, whole parts. Okay, just checking the other translation. Is not anything that is composite and a compound by nature liable to be split up into its component parts, and only that which is non-composite, if anything, is not likely to be split up. So that is the idea. So which one will scatter? This one or this one? Or this one scatter? It will not undergo these affections. That means this one here, the non-composite versus the composite. This is the one that will not disperse or scatter. Which was the point I was making here. Why doesn't the soul do this? So if he shows that it doesn't do this, then it would get rid of the possibility that you'd have newly constituted souls. So what does CB say? It seems to me that it has to be in this way. Socrates, is it not the case then, pardon me, is it not the case that in order for this to always exist according to the same and be maintained in the same way, it will most likely be akin to these that are incomposite? But on the other hand, those which change from one state into another and never abide according to the same are thus the composite. So then we have other ideas that in order for this to always exist, so you want something to always exist, one property, and stay the same, and be maintained in the same way, it will most likely be akin to these that are incomposite. So this is incomposite. But on the other hand, those which change from one state into another and never abide according to the same are thus the composite. So change from one state into another. And that's the collection of things that are a composite. Cebes, to me at least, it appears to be in this way. Socrates, then let us return to those same incomposite natures from which the reasoning proceeded before, to see if this essence to which we granted existence by reasoning, questions and answers, always has to be maintained according to the same, or whether it varies from one state to another, or if the self, or if the equal itself, the beautiful itself, and every self being which exists are also never susceptible to any metabolic transformation whatsoever, Or does each one of the selves who always exist by abiding uniformly self in self have to remain in the same way according to the same and must never in any way be susceptible to any alteration whatsoever? Right, so then it says, let us return to those same incomposite natures from which the reasoning proceeded before, to see if the essence to which we granted existence by the reasoning, by questions and answers, always has to be maintained according to the same, or whether it varies from one state to another. Right, so I think he's leaving the soul and going now into the ideas. So he's considering the ideas, and he's saying about, so you have beauty itself. What other one? Equal itself. And so then he's asking, let us return to see if always maintained according to the same, or whether it's okay. So the question is, do they stay the same, or do they vary from one state to another? Or if the equal itself, the beauty of itself, and every self being which exists are also never susceptible to metabolic transformation whatsoever, not susceptible to transformation. Well, actually, that's the same as this, isn't it? No transformation. Or does each one of these who always exist by abiding uniformly in and of themselves have to remain in the same way, according to the same, and must never in any way be susceptible to any alteration whatsoever? Alteration. Do they vary state or are altered? Okay, CBs. They must remain in the same way according to the same, O Socrates. Which is why? Because we covered that in the previous reading about how these are referred to when you see something beautiful using your senses. You then refer to beauty itself in order to compare, and then you recollect what beauty itself is. But if that changed, then you wouldn't have a reference point. These are reference points for being able to make conclusions with your senses. And they wouldn't be very good reference points if they always changed. But this reasoning is not in this section of the book. Reference points to compare sense perceptions too. On Socrates, on the other hand, what of the others, such as humans or horses or clothes or other such things whatsoever, or those that are equal or beautiful, or all those of the same name as those, do they have to remain according to the same, or do they exist in total contrast to those beings, selves neither subsisting according to selves, nor ever according to each other? Or, as to say it briefly, in no way remain according to the same. Right, so the other example, these are the ideas, and then what we want to call these. I'm going to call them worldly objects, things. But this is not how they're referred to in the text. But it does list them. It says, such as humans, horses, clothes. So these are specific things, but then he also lists or other such things whatsoever, or those that are equal. So these are instances of equal things. Beautiful things. Those that are equal or beautiful, or all those of the same name as those, do they have to remain according to the same? So, again, do they stay the same or vary? So these are reference points. And again, the question is, the ideas, whether they stay the same or vary, worldly objects, or whatever, do they stay the same or vary? Vary, state, or change. Okay. And so Seebe's replies in this way, for they can never be in the same way. So the answer by Seebe says it's this one. They vary, state, or change. Well, I guess it's this way around. He's pointing to them varying state. This is the worldly objects. Humans, horses, the list that's here. Right then, so Socrates, is it not the case then that on the one hand you can touch and see and perceive these with the other senses, but on the other hand is it the case that those abiding according to the same cannot be grasped in any other way whatsoever except by the reasoning of the understanding, but such entities are formless and not visible? Right, so is it not the case that on the one hand you can touch, so these ones here, so again we've got the the ideas and worldly things. And here we have the ideas. Then Socrates is saying that you can touch the worldly things, see, and otherwise sense, perceive them with the other senses, but on the other hand, is it the case that those abiding according to the same cannot be grasped in any other way except by reasoning? So how do you perceive? Here you touch, see, and sense, and here by reasoning. And the word for reasoning, logismo. Except by the reasoning of the understanding, dianoias. So this is reasoning, understanding, so these cannot be grasped in any other way whatsoever except by the reasoning, to logismo tes dianoias. But such entities are formless. These are formless. And not visible. Reasoning of the understanding. I'm not sure what reasoning of the understanding means. So, and this the other translation says, grasped only by the reasoning power of the mind. Reasoning power of the mind. Yeah. Reasoning power of the mind. Well, let me just get this to see what this one means. Tes dianoias. Of the intellect. Reasoning of the intellect. And what was this? Reasoning power of the mind. So this could be reasoning power of, could be intellect. Wonder what the etymology of Dionysus is. Ancient Greek. Inflection of Dionysus, genitive singular of. From is genitive from. From the intellect. So what does Dionysus mean? Dionysus, intention, purpose, process of thinking, capacity of thought, intelligence, understanding, and it comes from dia plus nous plus ia. So this is got dia as one bit, and then here you got nous as an N double O sigma. And what do each of these mean? So dia means through, or in different directions, across, through, over, different directions or apart. Etymology, see dia, from Proto-Indo-European dwis, related to dis, twice, and duo, and it means through, in a line, between, through. Well, if it's two, if there are two things, then that's how it can through, something that goes through two things, or in a line. Fine, if you've got 2 points you can make a line, or in the midst or between. Well, somehow it's connecting two things, and obviously this then means there's something in between them. But it means through or in between. Or causality, thanks to, or by aid of, because of. And what about nous? Nous means mind. Mind, perception, sense. An act of mind, thought, purpose, design. Oh, etymology, of uncertain etymology, perhaps from nail, I spin. Here meaning to spin the thread of the mind. Spin, thread of the mind. So if this is reasoning from the mind or through the mind, which is why it's translated here as understanding. In any case, Yeah, there's a difference between the ideas and the worldly things. To perceive the ideas, you need to employ reasoning and the mind, and to perceive the worldly things, you employ the senses. Cebes, what you say is altogether true. Socrates, are you willing then that we set up two kinds of being, so that one kind is visible while the other kind is formless? To de aiedes. Cebes, let us set this up. So we got two kinds, one visible, yeah, formless and visible. Here it's visible, two kinds of things. And on the one hand, the formless always remain according to the same, whereas on the other hand, the visible never remain according to the same. Cebes, let us set this up also. Socrates, come along then. One part of ourselves is the body, the other part is the soul. Right? So we have the body and the soul. This is 79b. Cebes, none other. Socrates, to which kind then shall we say the body is more alike and more akin? This is indeed clear to everyone, that it is more alike and more akin to the visible, said Cebes. Socrates, what then about the soul? Is it visible or formless? Cebes, it is indeed not visible to human beings, O Socrates. Right, okay, so this one is visible. The soul is invisible. Therefore, this one is more like this. Worldly things. Whereas the invisible one is more like this. The ideas. Okay. Socrates, but we do indeed speak of things that are naturally visible to human vision, and also of those that are not naturally visible, or does it seem to apply to any others? Cebes, to those visible to human vision. Socrates, what then do we say about the soul? Is she visible or invisible? Cebes, not visible. Socrates, accordingly then, she is formless. Yes. Accordingly then, soul is more like the formless than body. while on the other hand, the body is more like to the visible. It is altogether necessary, O Socrates. Is it also the case, then, that we stated the following not long ago, that when the soul, on the one hand, makes use of the body to investigate something, either by seeing or hearing or through some other sense, for this is to investigate something through the perceptions of the body, at that time she is dragged about by the body to things that are never abiding according to the same. And so the self is wandering about and is confused and dizzy, just as if it were drunk, insofar as it comes in contact with those kinds of things. By all means, indeed, said Cebes. So, when the body, when the body uses the senses to perceive other worldly objects, these are like visible objects, it investigates them through the perceptions of the body. She is dragged about the body to things that are never abiding according to the same. But these don't stay the same. And so the self wanders about and is confused and dizzy, just as if it were drunk, insofar as it comes into contact with these things. Whereas on the other hand, when she truly investigates in and of itself, she passes into that realm that is pure and eternal and deathless and remains and abides in the same way. So this is an investigation of the senses. And this is an investigation of when she truly investigates in and of itself, self according to self, she passes into that realm these are ideas. She passes into the realm that is pure in this realm. Pure, eternal, deathless, and remains, abides in the same way, and by being always akin with herself, she also becomes that. Whenever she arises into self according to self and goes out, self both ceases from wandering and always remains according to the same, in the same way, about those beings insofar as she remains in contact with such beings. And this experience, state, passion of the self is called mindfulness. Right, so when you're investigating, when the soul is investigating, is it? Who we're referring to? So here it says, when the soul, Suke, on the one hand, makes use of the body to investigate something, So here it's not so much here, this. It's actually this, because we're talking about the soul investigating. And when the soul is investigating, either by the senses or through the ideas, right? So when it says she, that's referring to the soul. And when she is drunk, wandering about and confused and dizzy, just as if she were drunk, insofar as she comes into contact with those other things. Whereas on the other hand, when she truly investigates in and of herself, she passes into that realm that is pure and eternal and remains abides. In the same way, and by being always akin with these, she also becomes them. So if you investigate according to the ideas, she also becomes that te gignitai ekenu. Whenever she arises into self according to self and goes out, she both ceases from wandering and always remains according to the same, in the same way, about those beings, the ideas, insofar as she remains in contact with such beings. So the soul, by doing this, soul approaches the ideas and becomes more like them, in the sense that she becomes more constant, or at least she experiences things that are more constant. She approaches the idea. I think I need to just check this bit 79D in the other translation, because it's quite a complicated bit. So 79D in the other translation is, but when the soul investigates by itself, it passes into the realm of what is pure. The soul investigates by itself, self in self, in and of itself. Oh, by itself, without the body. Right. It passes into the realm of what is pure, ever existing, immortal, and unchanging, and being akin to this, it always stays with it whenever it is by itself and can do so. It ceases to stray and remains in the same state as it is, in touch with things of the same kind. And experience then is what is called wisdom. So wisdom here is this word mindfulness here, which is phronesis. So she approaches them and becomes akin to, she also becomes that whenever she stays in and of itself. So investigation without the body, just by herself. She goes into the ideas, the soul approaches the ideas and becomes akin to them. And that the experience of doing this is called mindfulness, becomes akin to them, which then results in, well, one word is mindfulness, the other The other translation said wisdom, but the word was phronesis. Okay, so what is this word? Where did it come from? Phronesis. Ancient Greek. Practical wisdom. Why practical wisdom? From phroneo, to think, the former from phren, mind. So phroneo, think. Think. And what was the other word? Phren. Mind. And that's from Proto-Indo-European gren, soul or mind. Intellect, wits, mind. Gren. Proto-Indo-European gren. Mind. Or even soul, which is odd because we were talking about soul here. Okay. What you say is altogether elegantly said and true, O Socrates. Socrates, then in turn, from what we have seen before and from what we are now saying, to which of these two does it appear to you that soul is more alike and more akin? Cebes, it seems to me, O Socrates, that everyone would yield to this same type of method, even the dullest of men, that soul is wholly and altogether more like that which always abides in the same way, rather than that which does not. What then about the body? It is more like and more akin to the other. Look at it also in this way then, that whenever soul and body are in the self, nature orders the one to serve as subject and to be ruled, and the other to rule and be master or mistress. And according to this, which one in turn seems to you to be like the divine, and which like the mortal? Or does it not seem to you that on the one hand it is in the nature of the divine to be able to rule and to lead, whereas on the other hand it is in the nature of the mortal to be ruled and to serve as subject? Right, okay. So why does it mean that this one, why is the soul more like the ideas? When the self, so this is a self made up, or a human, made up of body and soul. When the soul investigates according to the senses, becomes drunk and wanders. When the soul investigates according to just herself, she enters and becomes more kin to the ideas, which results in mindfulness and wisdom. Therefore, the soul is more like the unchanging ideas, and the body is more like the worldly, invisible objects. I mean, I see that. It makes sense to me. I'm not sure why I see that. I see that the soul is invisible and the ideas are invisible, and that the body is visible and worldly objects are visible. So that's why, to me, the soul is more like the ideas. I'm not sure why this different investigating makes her more like, her being the soul, more like the ideas. Because I mean, when the soul tries to do things that are not like her, the effect isn't good. The soul, maybe that's true. When the soul tries to investigate things that aren't like her, i.e. the worldly objects that don't stay the same, then the effect is confusion. Because let's see that bit again. When the soul on the one hand makes use of the body to investigate something, either by seeing or hearing or through some other sense, for this is doing it through the perceptions of the body, she is dragged about by the body to things that are never abiding according to the same, and so she wanders about and is confused, dizzy. And you wouldn't be in this state if this state was according or akin to your nature. Just as if she were drunk, insofar as she comes in contact with those kinds of things. So this is the crucial bit. When the soul tries to investigate using the body, it results in these states: drunk, confused, dizzy, and that points to it being, these things not being akin to the soul. Whereas a different thing happens when the soul investigates according to herself without the body. She can approach the ideas and become akin to them, resulting in wisdom. So I think this other section here moves on here to look at also the difference in terms of whether they are more akin to masters or subjects, and that's ATA, but I think I'll leave that until next time, so I'll pick up from ATA next time.